So in this video I'm going to be teaching you the rules on how to play poker. Now in my experience from teaching friends and running my university's poker society, the quickest and most effective way to teach people is to show them a hand or two all the way through so they get an overview, and then for them to play quite a few hands themselves. Now obviously I can't do the second part for you, but I can of course do the first. So first of all we'll look at the general setup of the game. Now there's three main positions that you're going to need to remember and be aware of, and that is the button in the top left, the small blind in the top right, and the big blind on the right. So the button doesn't have a huge amount of significance for pre-flop, and it's mostly just used to indicate where the small and big blind are. However, the small and big blinds are required to put in a small amount of money before the cards are dealt, and players can make decisions. So the small blind is half of the big blind, and of course these positions rotate around every hand, so it's not just the same person putting in the money all the time. Now on the surface, poker is pretty straightforward, to be honest. There's only at most 3 different decisions you can actually make, and there's quite a lot of cases where you're only going to have 2. Now of course deciding which one to use can get quite difficult, but that's not for this video. So we are going to look at a hand, I promise. We just need to look at one last thing before that. So that is the 4 different streets. You have pre-flop, flop, turn, and river. Now you don't need to worry about remembering the names or what these actually are for now. All that's important is how you get from one to the next. So we move on to the next one whenever everyone has put the same amount of money into the pot for that street, and there's more than one person left in the hand, because obviously if there's only one person left, then they win the pot outright. So rather than moving on to the next street, in that case you just move on to the next hand. So we are now going to start looking at an actual hand, starting from the first street, which is of course pre-flop. And pre-flop, the first person to act is the one left of the big blind, so the opposite side of the big blind to the small blind. So as mentioned before, we're going to have 3 decisions at this point. So we can fold, we can call, or we can raise. Now I'm going to go over each one in turn, starting with fold. So when you fold, you're essentially giving up on this hand. You don't have to put any more money into the pot, but you also can't win the pot either. So you're going to do this when you feel like your opponent has a better hand than you. So obviously here where we have ace king, we don't want to be folding. So the next option we have is to call. Now when you call, you essentially just match the current bet, which is currently 100. And the last option is to raise. So this is where you increase the current bet, and therefore increase the amount that everyone else has to put in if they want to see the next street. There are 2 ways in which you can use this, the first of which is to try to get more money out of a good hand. The second of which is to try to bluff with a bad hand and convince your opponent to fold. So we're going to go ahead and raise here, but obviously you know that we can't just raise to 101. There is a minimum of double the current bet. So we could go 300, 400, we can actually put all of our chips in at once, but here we're just going to go over the minimum of 200. So now that we've made our decision, it is now the next player's turn. So that is the player on the left of us, i.e. player 1. And they have the exact same 3 decisions that we did, so they can fold, they can call, or they can re-raise. So let's suppose that they decide to re-raise. So go to double the current bet, which is 400. So after he's made his decision, it's then the turn of the player on the left of him, which is player 2. So again, the same 3 choices, fold, call, or raise. Let's suppose he doesn't really like his hand, and so he decides to fold. So after that, the player on the left of him gets to make his decision, which is the button, and it's the same 3 choices as before. He can fold, he can call, or he can raise. So we'll assume he quite likes his hand, and he decides to call. And after that, it's the small blind's turn. So again, fold, call, raise. If he decides to call, he only has to put another 350 in to match the bet of 400, as he's already put 50 in. And then it's the big blind's turn. Fold, call, raise. Once again, if he decides to call, obviously he only has to put 300 in. However, if he folds, he doesn't get that 100 back, because it's already in the pot. So it's once again on us, because everyone put 400 in, the same as everyone else. And we could obviously fold or raise, but we're just going to call for 200. So everyone's putting the same amount, and there's more than one player left, so we move on to the next street, which is the flop. Now the flop is where the first 3 cards are dealt to the board, and also from the flop onwards, so the flop, turn and river, the small blind is the first to act, and the button is the last to act. So it's a different order to pre-flop. Now you might remember how I said quite often you're only going to have 2 decisions. So this is one of those cases, and essentially what happens is on each street the current bet will reset to 0. So this gives you a new option, which is to check. So essentially, because the bet is 0, there is no reason for you to fold. So your two options are to check or to bet. So if you check, you're just deciding not to bet, to keep the bet at 0, and it passes on to the next player. So let's suppose that the small blind decides to check, so it then passes over to us. So if the big blind was still in, it would be their turn to act, but because they're folded, they're out of the hand. So that's how it goes. So the current bet is still 0, so our two options are to check or to bet. Obviously we have quite a good hand, so we're going to want to bet and try and build the pot up a bit. Now the minimum bet is 1 big blind, but of course that is just a minimum, so you can go above that. So we're going to go ahead and bet 800. So after we've made our decision, it moves to the player on the left of us. So because the bet is no longer 0, he no longer has the option to check. So instead he can either call, fold or raise. Let's suppose that he folds, and the same goes for the button, he folds as well. Goes back to the small blind, and we'll assume that he calls. Now because everyone's putting the same amount of money into the pot for the street, and as there's more than one player left, we go on to the next, which is the turn. So the fourth card gets dealt to the board, the bet resets back to 0, and it's once again the small blind's turn to act. So remember that because the bet has gone back to 0, it's the option to either check or bet here. So we'll just assume that he checks, it's back to us, and as the bet's still 0, we either check or bet. So we'll just say that we check here, and so if everyone checks, you move on to the next street, same as you would normally. So we move on to the last street, which is the river. So the fifth card gets dealt to the board, the bet goes back to 0, and it's our opponent's turn. So this time he's going to bet for 2,000. So we could obviously fold or raise, but this time we're just going to call for 2,000. So if it gets to this point, because there's no more streets, we just go straight to showdown, which where whoever's the best hand wins the pot. And with that, we have a pair of aces, whereas our opponent has a pair of queens, so the pot is ours. And we move on to the next hand. So that's everything. Obviously it's probably worth watching that 2 or 3 times just to fully understand it all, because it's quite a lot of information to take in one go. But hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you for another video next week.